Okay. Thank you very much. And yes, I'm very happy that we are gathered in this way from several continents, and I wish you all very welcome on behalf of the Liberal International's Human Rights Committee. I hope, of which I am now the chair. I also hope that my predecessor and dear friend Markus Löning from Germany will be joining us during the session. You know that this has been weeks full of digital activities for Liberal International, because we had the virtual Congress instead of the Congress real life. It went really well. And we have had a series of interesting debates and activities around that Congress at this time of the day when it's early morning in America or late evening in Asia, where everybody could be. We had the first event on disinformation, how to end it, and now the title of today's debate is Safeguarding Human Rights in the Digital Age. Because, of course, the Human Rights Committee is trying to elaborate 10 principles on digitalization and human rights for the Liberal International. We know that there might be new things that we should tend to, because really there has been in many countries a leap of digitalization during the COVID times. I hope that we also, when we are elaborating the principles, can take into account what we have learned during the last months, and months that certainly will continue when we are prevented from meeting physically. I think some of the things I already would like to mention is that we need reliable platforms. All the platforms that we are using are not reliable. That we have learned. Some people have not been able to participate in online because they fear that somebody comes in from the back. Question of dual use technology has also been much debated, and I understood lately that the European Council did not accept rules on that proposed by the European Commission. You know, dual use, something that can be as cyber attacks used in a with bad aims, as we know other technologies as well, but no legislation was passed on that according to, for instance, facial recognition. And then I cannot refrain from sharing the latest experience in Finland here, where there were hackers that could access the records, digital records of a big company doing psychotherapy. Exactly that kind of information, personal, sensitive information, that should be well protected. I think many of us have learned much about that. You know, what is that you need to know as a citizen, and what are the responsibilities of those companies taking care of such sensitive information? Better and better certification, because it is that those records have gone public. There have been blackmailing also. And you might note that Finland is heading for membership of the UN Human Rights Council next year in the elections. And as part of that, we have Freedom Coalition online, and where I have learned lately that only 32 member countries, and I think really that this coalition should be growing, and we should be ensuring that all countries interested in that could be on and cooperating for freedom online. Lastly, but not least, I also want to mention that we are very happy that Radikale Venstre from Denmark, our member party, Social Liberal Party of Denmark, is also supporting us in this work. And we are launching soon a campaign exactly on digitalization and human rights. I'm very, very happy that we can launch this campaign. And certainly I hope that we soon next year will be able to nail down the 10 principles. With this short, little bit hasty introduction, I want to give the floor to our moderator for the session, Karen Melchior. She's the present MEP of the member of the European Parliament from Radikale Venstre, elected there in 2019. 19, and serving, for instance, on the Committee on Legal Affairs, which is one of the important committees relating to human rights. And she's also a member of the European Internet Forum. So dear Karen, the floor is yours, and I hand the moderation over to you. I'm very happy that we have you, Karen, Marietje, and Felicia on board with us. So the floor is yours, Karen.
Thank you very much, Astrid. And I'm honored and a little bit nervous about being the moderator of the two speakers that we have today, Marietje Schaake, the International Policy Director of Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center and International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence and President of the Cyber Peace Institute. Marietje served for 10 years as a member of the European Parliament for D66, the Dutch Social Liberal Party, where she focused on trade, foreign affairs, and technology policies, which is right in the center of what we will be discussing today. Felicia Anthonio is working with Access Now as a campaigner for Keep It On, a global campaign that fights against internet shutdowns. The Keep It On coalition is made up of more than 210 organizations. And before joining Access Now, she was a program associate for the Media Foundation for West Africa. So these are two experts that we will be having a presentation of about 5 minutes, first from Marietje and then from Felicia. And for those of you out there, if you want to engage in the debate, please on Twitter use the hashtag #LIPolicyLab, and we will be following up on the debate on Twitter as we go along, and probably also afterwards. So the floor is yours, Marietje, for opening remarks for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Karen and Astrid, everybody in the Liberal International team. It's just great to be reconnected with you. It seems like a lifetime ago that I was still a member of the European Parliament, and that we could all travel to LI meetings and informally connect on not only the official program, but also on the broader liberal agenda and how we might move it ahead. So I think talking about human rights in the digital age is very, very timely. I think it was timely 10 years ago, but the pandemic has really put a spotlight on some of the core questions about who has the power to govern in the digital world. And that's really what I wanted to focus on, because I think there's quite a rich tradition of highlighting the need to protect privacy, to protect data, to make sure that there's not repression. Astrid mentioned dual use items. I spent a fair amount of my time in the European Parliament trying to curb the export of surveillance and hacking tools, and it saddens me that not more progress has been made in this space. But perhaps underlying everything and exacerbated by the pandemic is the question, is it legitimate that private companies develop, design, govern not only the architecture of the digital world, but also the data flows and information that flows over it? And I think it brings us to quite a big core question, which is what happens if you do not deliberately safeguard universal human rights in the digital world? And this is the situation we find ourselves in. Initially, the digital revolution went hand in hand with quite the promise and the expectation and the hope that the technologies such as mobile phones and social media platforms themselves would have a liberalizing effect, that it would empower people to such an extent that they could break through monopolies of power, monopolies of information, and that there would almost be virality of democracy. And of course, this promise sounded extremely attractive. I recall the early days of serving in European Parliament approximately 10 years ago, when uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East brought together a lot of young people who were justly asking for more freedom, more justice, an end to corruption, an end to the repression that they were facing, and essentially respect for their human rights. And it was then that a lot of people labeled these uprisings as Facebook and Twitter revolutions, and that people thought that as long as internet freedom spread around the world, that the results would be positive. Now, fast forward to today, and I think a big lesson learned came in 2016, is that the connectivity, the privatized connectivity through search, through social media, through essentially almost every aspect of every sector that touches on vital parts of people's lives, is now governed for by private companies that are not held to account for their respect for human rights. In fact, they have a profit objective, and they're probably mostly motivated by creating more efficiency, longer time spent online, better revenues for shareholders and venture capitalists. And I think if we go back a little bit longer in history, and if we look around the world, it's quite clear that if you do not proactively defend and carry out those values like universal human rights, but also democratic principles, fundamental freedoms, you lose them. And so I think the real agenda for us liberals is, and this is perhaps a bit in a tension with where liberal parties tend to find themselves, is to fundamentally start pushing back against the notion that digitization always means privatization, and that there have to be safeguards to preserve universal human rights online, to preserve democratic principles in the digital world, and to ensure that fundamental freedoms actually mean something as digitization and technology disrupt. And so I would hope that in the variety of policy areas that are before people like Karen and others in the member states as well, and all over the world, in fact, that beyond just looking at, for example, what kind of copyright protection is legitimate, how digital services should be organized, the way in which artificial intelligence is subject to rules and regulations, that the principal question of who has the legitimate power to make those decisions and how do we organize independent oversight and independent research into what is actually happening under the hood of these massively powerful companies takes center. And I think that we owe it to our tradition of standing for open societies and the rights of people to actually focus on that. But we have to be careful that we ourselves as liberals, and I say this in a sort of big tent meaning, are not giving too much space to the private sector. I think that's been one of the biggest mistakes in how we've handled digitization, and it needs to be corrected urgently. I'll leave my introduction there. I hope it was not too long, and I'm happy to answer questions and to engage with you going forward if that's ever helpful.
Thank you very much, Marietje. That was inspiring and many good points for discussion later. Felicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Karen. And it's really a great pleasure to be with all of you here today to discuss the issues of internet rights and digital rights or human rights in the digital age. And as Karen and Marietje did mention in their remarks, the internet access has become so crucial, especially with during the pandemic. And we've seen that lots and lots of people need to be connected online, first to continue their offline activities, and at the same time to stay safe or prevent the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And on the flip side, Marietje did mention the role that the private companies are playing in this important discussion with regards to digital rights or human rights in the digital age. But on the flip side, I would want to highlight the fact that governments are being responsible for silencing their citizens through internet shutdowns, which violate several human rights like access to information, freedom of opinion and expression, as well as freedom of assembly rights. And at Access Now, under the Keep It On campaign, which was launched in 2016, we've been documenting and monitoring internet shutdowns over the years. And our latest report, which was published in 2019, did highlight the fact that internet shutdowns are increasing and they are lasting longer and they're affecting vulnerable groups. And so Karen did mention the Keep It On Coalition and what we do, but I just want to highlight some of the strategies that we do use to engage with governments to ensure that people are aware that internet shutdowns are not an option and they are in clear violation of human rights of people, and the fact that everybody is supposed to join this campaign to ensure that we put an end to internet shutdowns. And so from 2019, we've recorded 213 cases of shutdowns in 33 countries, as compared to 196 the previous year. And this year, we've seen several incidents of internet shutdowns, with over 3 happening this week. Tanzania holding elections, and the internet was disrupted a few days before and during the elections. Guinea did disrupt internet access when election results were being announced over this weekend. And then we know about the shutdown that is happening in Belarus since the elections happened in August. And so internet shutdowns are increasing around the world. Governments that haven't even shut down the internet before are resorting to these measures to stifle dissent and prevent or quell protests. And so I'm really happy to be on this panel to highlight some of the impacts that these shutdowns have on people's lives. Once the conversation unfolds, I would highlight some of the documentaries or stories that we've curated with regards to how internet shutdowns are impacting lives, and then also to urge the international community to join the campaign to end internet shutdowns, because the impacts are really devastating, and we do all have a role to play in putting an end to internet shutdowns around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I find it quite interesting that Marietje was discussing how we need to have governments and regulation controlling the private companies and the platforms, making them more reliable and accountable. But at the same point, Felicia, you were mentioning how certain governments are not reliable to actually protect the rights of their citizens. But are actually using digitalization to silence their citizens by simply switching the internet off when it's politically useful for them. A question to both of you: how do we manage this balance of both wanting to have governments that make businesses more accountable, but at the same time not wanting to give too many tools in the hands of governments that want to use technology and digitalization against their citizens?
Do you want me to start? Or yeah, no, I think that's a crucial question, and I think oftentimes in the discussion about regulation, this distinction between democratic and authoritarian or more repressive governments gets lost. Too often we hear talk about what governments should do, but of course here, as with the private sector, we need to ask ourselves, with what legitimacy are these decisions made? And I think, unfortunately, oftentimes the kinds of repressive behavior that Felicia so clearly highlighted are happening anyway, whether democratic governments regulate or not. But at the same time, we've seen that democratic governments who operate on the basis of democratic principles and with respect for human rights, most of the time, are not incentivized to actually step up their role. And so I actually think that the two can go hand in hand. For example, there's still a lot of development resources going from democratic nations to developing nations, but there's hardly a coordinated agenda, an integrated agenda on what that means for technology infrastructure, for example. So we've seen over and over again that networks in the sort of infrastructural sense are being rolled out, assisted by development money, in countries where data is not protected, where the rights of people are not protected. And so it actually only exacerbates the ability of repressive regimes to control their citizens if there is not clear conditions put to that kind of cooperation or trade, for that matter. And so I think it's a question of governing on the basis of which principles. I mean, I could even be happy with a company that says, we are going to make our policy decisions as a private organization completely aligned with universal human rights. That would be a very welcome step. But the idea that there's no clear articulation and no clear enforcement of principles in governing decisions except for either profit or repression, I think it's a dead end. And I feel like democratic governments have particularly abdicated their responsibility to shape the digital world with respect for universal human rights and to hold others to account, themselves first and foremost, but also others, and have rather hoped that in a vacuum good results would come out. And we now know more than enough that that is not happening. And so I think it's a matter of catching up and of distinguishing between governments on the basis of which values they adhere to and they hold themselves to as well.
Felicia?
Yes, definitely. I do agree with Marietje, because in our monitoring, we do document shutdowns happening in both democratic and undemocratic countries. And interestingly, what I still maintain or find a bit of a challenge is the fact that we do have incidents where there are private companies like the telecom service providers that are being ordered by governments to disrupt internet. And some of these telcos are either private or state-owned. And they are kind of complicit in ensuring or undertaking these shutdowns that violate the rights of people. And so, yes, all these stakeholders, we do have a role to play, like I said initially, to ensure that the right measures are being put in place so that not just one party has the right or the power to disrupt internet, but then once the right measures are put in place, one government or one party doesn't just wake up and say, I need you to shut down the internet on this day without any explanation. And then telcos that are operating in such countries for the fact that they have some legal contracts with governments and also to protect their own business as well as their licenses in order to operate in these countries, are forced to kind of undertake whatever order that is coming from the government. And so the right regulations or the right perspectives have to be put in place to ensure that these power is not given to one party. And I'm really excited to know or to know that Marietje is also looking at both sides coming together to kind of work together to ensure that the rights of people are not violated online or in any both democratic and undemocratic states.
We've received one question concerning, is there anything that the international community can do to prevent internet shutdowns from happening? And I would like to add to that, we're looking into trying to have a Magnitsky Act in Europe, protecting human rights across the world and not allowing persons and companies to breach human rights abroad and then hide their money in the EU or live here. So first, the general question, is there anything that we can do to prevent the internet shutdowns from happening? And also, how can we keep the telcos responsible for their actions? Because a lot of these, I imagine, are perhaps international telcos that have ownership from Europe or United States.
Definitely, there are efforts being made around globally to fight internet shutdowns. For instance, the UN has passed resolutions denouncing internet shutdowns and urging state parties to stop resorting to them even in times of crisis. And then we have the Freedom Online Coalition that was previously mentioned, a network of over 30 governments that have condemned internet shutdowns and continue to speak against the use of such measures by governments. And I think the most recent example that happened was at the height of the COVID-19 crisis. The FOC did issue a statement urging state actors or governments to ensure that people have access to the internet and not resort to shutting down the internet during this crucial time. And then also with the various shutdowns that happened in Belarus, a statement was being issued by over 20 governments condemning the use of internet shutdowns to stifle expression and other human rights. And so these are some of the measures that are being done internationally to ensure that people or governments are being held accountable. And through the Keep It On coalition, we do also resort to taking governments to courts because when we try all our strategies and they continue to shut down the internet, we do resort to litigation as well to ensure that these governments stop disrupting the internet. And I just want to cite two cases in which we actually had the courts rule in favor of us saying that internet shutdowns violated human rights. And one happened in at the ECOWAS court, where the court ruled that the shutdowns that were ordered by the government of Togo in 2017 were illegal and did violate people's rights. And there was a similar ruling in Indonesia, where the court also indicated that shutdowns violate the rights of the people. So these are some of the precedents that we want to see in the space. And then also once there's a shutdown and governments are quick to denounce it and condemn it, I think it kind of tarnishes the reputation of governments that resort to these measures. And then it forces them to actually stop disrupting the internet just when they feel like doing it. And so we need more voices in the space to ensure that these shutdowns are condemned and the right measures are taken to put an end to them.
Marietje, with your experience, is there anything we as regulators or policymakers could do to help this along?
Well, I do think that the whole notion of accountability is extremely important, but sometimes, and this may sound counterintuitive, it may help to highlight the economic costs for the governments involved. I mean, it's not hard for us to agree that the human rights violations are a huge priority. But sometimes the accountability comes through economic losses. And that could be an avenue to pursue, which could create bigger support against these efforts and which may also loop in the companies involved. Because really, who do you take orders from and what kind of loyalty does that build? What kind of image problems does it build? I think could be an avenue to pursue a bit more in this space. Also to get parties on board who are not as ambitious as we are as liberals to highlight human rights violations and to attach consequences like sanctions only for that, which I think, more people should support. But I recall endless hours of negotiations with some of our friends in the Christian Democratic parties where just mentioning human rights violations, if it was not their particularly favorite group, was something that had to be debated. So building a broad coalition behind this, I think, is vital. And therefore, assessing all the aspects of why there's a problem stemming from the blanket shutdown of the internet is a viable way to go.
So hoping that the money will encourage governments where just doing the right thing is not enough. I was quite interested in the point that you made, Marietje, earlier about digitalization does not always mean privatization. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, no, I think actually it does these days. So I think that democratic governments unfortunately have created a situation where private companies are governing essentially all parts of the digital world. They're building critical infrastructure, defending critical infrastructure, creating currencies. They are defending the nation through defensive capabilities, but unfortunately, increasingly also helping offensive. So attack type capabilities with technology. If you think about the notion of smart cities, the people benefiting most of insights into people's behavior are companies, not so much the local governments. And so the idea that the public interest needs more defending and also needs more access to information, more knowledge about how streams of data flow, what the acceptable kind of risk is that we want to take with new products that are entered into the market, requires a better sense of, you know, what we're talking about. And I noticed this at Stanford. Stanford is really, you know, the birthplace of a lot of the corporations in Silicon Valley. And still, for Stanford researchers, it is nearly impossible to get meaningful access to information to actually assess, for example, how significant is disinformation around elections? What effects does it really have? How easily are people persuaded by, let's say, conspiracy theories versus news stories? And does it translate into offline behavioral change? For example, does information just stay in people's thoughts, or do they take to the streets to, you know, attack people or stay home instead of voting? Very, very fundamental civic actions, and their impacts need to be researched. And generally, we can see historically how important information has been. Hardly any military coup or power change happened without a significant information aspect. Recall the images of people taking over the TV broadcasters to share the notion that they are, you know, responsible and whatnot. Information is power, and we've allowed information to be governed by advertising companies by and large, or at least commercial companies. And I think that has completely unbalanced the whole governing space, and it has challenged accountability. It has eroded democratic principles. It has harmed universal human rights and fundamental freedoms. And it is really important to act now, to put the rule of law first, and to make sure that those principles are guiding us and that not the technology is guiding us.
One of the ways to address this that I've heard from an Oxford academic was that we needed to have more transparency and more access to the data that the companies are collecting, because as you mentioned, we lack the research on the information that is available, but in order to do the research, we need the data. So do you see that this is the way of one of the demands that we should be making on the platforms to make more available data, and how broadly available should the data be made, and which kind of data do you think that we should call for getting access?
Yeah, so I think, as we see in other areas, let's take antitrust as a model. There's sensitive information involved from a competitive advantage point of view. Companies simply do not want to share their biggest details of how they work, whether it's when they're creating food or a drink like the one that I have here, or whether they're creating devices like the one that I have here. They don't want to reveal their secrets. And there is a legitimate point to be made that if everything were to be open, that, you know, their secret would be revealed. But that does not mean that they cannot be regulated. So the model of antitrust appeals to me because there is a regulator mandated, often highly skilled with the right legal and separate expertise to dig into whether the automotive sector has become a cartel, or whether milk farmers have agreed on prices illegally, or whether Google's search algorithm prefers certain products or outcomes. Now, that is a kind of accountability through more access to information for the proper entities. And I think a model could be imagined where a certain category of access to information, while preserving privacy, can serve academics. Another set of principles can serve regulators that are mandated for it. But also generally, the right to access to information is an important one. And it is also important for journalists, for civil society organizations, for citizens, for parliamentarians to be informed about the products that they use. So I think there's general room and legitimate reason to really open up a lot more information in the public interest about how these platforms work, how they govern data, and what impact that has. And so I think it's both a broad point that needs to be addressed and requires some specific guidelines on who has access to which information and why. And then it's not a kind question to companies. It will simply have to be required, whether there's goodwill or ill will on the part of the companies themselves.
Thank you very much, Marietje. We've received a more general question. How can we reconcile the fact that the jurisdictions for redress of human rights abuses online, national bodies, ombudsman, data protection agencies, or even national courts don't match the jurisdiction of the internet companies, which are global in nature? I mean, as a member of the European Parliament, I would want the European Parliament to set the global standard, but I mean, that's not the way that the world works. So Felicia, how do you see that we should reconcile these two conflicting jurisdictions?
Unfortunately, I think human rights abuses do happen, and it only takes the political will of governments to either continue to abuse the rights of their citizens or to put an end to it. And sadly, there are some of these national ombudsmen or data protection agencies are not independent in some countries, thereby definitely would carry out the whims and caprices of what the government requires. And so it's really an important question that needs clear guidelines, like Marietje said, to ensure that governments are held accountable for these abuses. And definitely we do know that governments have signed up to international frameworks like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civic and Political Rights, yet they do violate the rights of people, despite the fact that they've ratified these frameworks. And even in their national constitutions, there are sections that do guarantee these rights that are usually abused, but then we still have reports of governments disrupting or abusing the rights of their people. So I think it goes aside the fact that we need rights respecting frameworks in place. I do also think that partly it's tied to the fact that it's tied to the political will of governments or stakeholders to ensure that people's rights are put or are prioritized at all times.
Good. Marietje, you are still with us. It seems you had some thoughts on how the matter of scale and impact vis-a-vis global operating companies linked to how democracies can claim back power in the digital world. If you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so I saw the question about, how to deal with the mismatch essentially between territorially operating governments and globally operating private companies. And I think here there's a real opportunity for like-minded governments, like democracies, to work together and to create a significant area where there would be as much of a level playing field as possible in terms of, which rules should apply. So I would hope that democracies can pool their efforts, both vis-a-vis the private entities, but also in international organizations where it's no secret that they already are, in a tense kind of majority-minority relation, often losing votes. So this only illustrates how much democracy as such and democratic countries together are under pressure. And so it's important that they bundle their powers, that they work with like-mindeds across the world, and that, for example, civil society supports these efforts. So I think there's still a lot of work that can be done by globally cooperating and thereby leveraging essentially the scale vis-a-vis the big companies. And if the EU can do it with the GDPR, then I think there's a lot more opportunity to take such space in other areas.
I'm happy to hear such a kind of optimistic point of view that we still have a role to play as legislators in the world. I think it's really important that we also actually claim that role, and that we as liberals don't hold back too much, saying that, well, this is private companies, this is their data, we need to allow the market to play its role, because I do believe that we have always corrected imbalances in markets as regulators, and that we also need to do this on a digital scale. A question to both of you was, how do we do this? I mean, Melchior, you mentioned antitrust earlier. There is also talk about, well, how are we going to do competition law in the digital sphere? And Felicia, also that the internet started as being something that was a network where there was not one point where you could switch off the internet. Is there a more technical way that we can make sure that one government cannot switch off the entire internet for a company? Marietje, you were just talking, so I'll let Felicia lead on this, and then Marietje, you need to leave pretty soon.
Yes,
so
I think you all are going into a different session as well, but I'm not in charge of the agenda, but that's my understanding.
Yes, we are. We're switching the Facebook Live off. Do you have time for Felicia to talk and then come in? Sure. Perfect. So Felicia.
Yes, that's quite an interesting question, but I will try to respond. I think that there are various ways that the internet is being disrupted by governments or state actors. And usually from the data that we have come across, it's usually an order to the various ISPs operating in countries to say that switch off either the whole internet, or slow down the internet, or block access to social media platforms ahead of important national events, like what happened in Tanzania. And most of the time, depending on the government, there is an evidence being sent to the telcos, or the order being sent to telcos, which is usually leaked or shared with civil society organizations working to end internet shutdowns. Other times, there is nothing, you just know that the internet is off. There's no explanation, and maybe the usual explanations we would probably get from the government is to ensure national security, or to prevent the spread of fake news, and that is misinformation and disinformation. And so you don't actually get to know how the governments are able to disrupt it unless a lot of investigation goes into it, like what happened in Belarus, where it was discovered that Sandvine and Francisco partners were the ones that actually provided the equipment that helped the government to disrupt the internet through deep packet inspection. And so this is a very important investigation that came out, and we did hold Sandvine accountable for the disruptions that happened. And we're happy to hear that they've canceled whatever contracts they had with the government regarding this. But then these are the kind of results that we need to hold both the private and the state actors accountable for disrupting the internet. And so I think the telcos really play a key role here. And most of the time they are tied between their licenses or their profits, or should they uphold the rights of the people, which makes it difficult for them. And they would choose the easy way out, that is just undertake whatever order is being given, rather than battle with the government and end up losing whatever business they are operating in that country. And so I think that is something that we need continuous conversation to see how we can merge the powers, and who should give an order for an internet to be disrupted. Should there be a warrant? If there should, should it be from just any court or an independent court? And who decides what an independent court is? So these are some of the things that we need political figures like you to be able to push to ensure that this kind of, how do I say it? Yeah, that is what we need to ensure that no one party just has the power to decide when the internet should go off or come back on.
No, I think, and it also underlines the important work that Marietje was doing on export licensing and dual use technology. So Marietje, for how do we deal with competition, and also if you have any final remarks before you have to leave?
Yeah, well, I think in general, the competition question is not the most controversial one, but the enforcement part should be really stepped up. I think private tech companies benefit a great deal from the length of time it takes to investigate, from the appeals mechanisms, and too often simply calculate the fines as a part of the cost of doing business. And so I think it's really important that the trust in antitrust and competition is maintained. So, you know, the rigor with which the investigations happen should be firm, but there is room to look at balancing out the sanctions with the actual benefits that the companies enjoy. And then I was really encouraged, and I would recommend all of you to read it, with the staff report of the House Judiciary Committee in the United States, that actually looks at the harms to democracy coming from big tech monopolistic tendencies and whatnot. So there's a trend to look not only at harms to the economy, but also at harms to society, to democracy. And I personally believe that it's entirely legitimate to hold companies to account for those harms, so that they don't have to be a side effect only of successful competition policy, but rather that if we see that companies, whether they're large or small, are actually harming democracy, harming human rights, harming society, let's also think about public safety, public health, tons of examples we've seen recently around the pandemic, that there is accountability for that. And so I think we can take inspiration from competition and antitrust without sort of narrowing the scope of the policy uniquely to antitrust, but rather apply the mechanisms, the way to inquire, to investigate that I highlighted earlier, and the strength of the enforcement, which I think needs to be upgraded to a broader set of harms. So I think building on existing legal principles and methods and mechanisms is often better than reinventing the wheel entirely. It's important. For example, we hear a lot of initiatives around digital bills of rights, but we already have universal human rights. So let's be careful that we don't create a sort of parallel universe in the digital world, because the digital is very much connected to the world that we live in. And it's entirely legitimate that regulations and laws apply to digitally operating companies as they do to any other entity.
Thank you very much, Marietje. And before we close the Facebook Live, Felicia, if you have any thoughts to close off the discussion.
I don't have any final remarks. I think, sorry, go ahead.
All right, just to say that it's really been a pleasure being on this panel and listening to Marietje and share her knowledge about what she's doing in this space. And then I just want to use the platform to encourage more and more stakeholders to prioritize digital rights and work towards ensuring that they are promoted and protected at all times. And definitely COVID-19 has underscored more than ever the importance of the internet in our lives. And so there is a need for each and every one of us to protect that space. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for a very interesting and enlightening discussion. And Astrid, do you want to say any final words on behalf of the Human Rights Committee of Liberals International before we close?
Well, I must say that I normally never believe people when they say we should have needed much more time for a discussion, but that this is a situation where we would have needed to go forward with some of the questions, like, is there a blanket law that we could, which is the country that is going the furthest? How do we rely on the ICANN, one of the organizations that used to govern the numbers and the IP addresses? Which country is good in development policy, like was also underlined. So I think you have given us a lot food for thought, and we need to continue this debate. But also thank you for the encouragement that we are not going to have a special law on digital rights, because that has been our starting points, that human rights should be there also digitally. So thank you for this part. And I can just say that we will continue, and I'm very grateful to you, Karen, that you are moderating in such a superb way. And thank you to Marietje and to Felicia very much for their very, very thoughtful engagement and words here during our conversation. So thank you for that.